Did you know that this picture was actually the cover of a medical textbook in 1863? Yep, there's a reason why we don't use leeches anymore. But leeches weren't the only creepy crawlies used in medieval medicine. Let's step quietly into a medieval hospital. Forget the sterile smell of disinfectant, the beeping machines, and overworked nurses. Instead, imagine walking into a dim stone hall, lit by flickering candles. The air is thick with incense, herbs, and, unfortunately, the smell of unwashed bodies. Hospitals back then weren't really medical centers in the modern sense. They were more like a mix of church, poorhouse, and hospice. The word hospital itself comes from the Latin hospice, meaning guest. These weren't places where you went to get cured of pneumonia. They were places you went to be, looked after while God decided what to do with you. The vast majority of hospitals back then were run by religious orders, mostly monks or nuns, who saw caring for the sick as a holy calling. Some were attached to monasteries, taking in not just pilgrims, but also local poor or people too sick to work. Others specialized in one type of patient, like skin diseases or mental illness. Bethlehem Hospital in London, for example, took in the city's insane, criminals, and beggars. It was a bit of a revolving door between those three groups, to be honest. And these hospitals weren't just for adults. Children were admitted too, though they were usually lumped in with the adults. No pediatric ward back then. A lot of these hospitals were set up to deal with the masses. Think of them less as individual health centers and more as triage centers for public health crises. They treated the overflow when cities were hit with plagues or famines, essentially acting as storage containers until people either got better or died. So right off the bat, we need to clear up a common misconception. When you think medieval hospital, you probably imagine bloodletting. That famous painting of the four humors showing someone getting bled dry. That's from the Middle Ages, but that image isn't quite accurate. Bloodletting, or removing blood through leeches or lancing veins, was practiced throughout history, but it was most popular in the late 19th century, not the Middle Ages. Medieval physicians didn't want patients to lose too much blood, otherwise you might die. See, during the Middle Ages, the dominant medical theory was the four humors, which said that everyone had four essential substances inside them: blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. To be healthy, these four needed to be balanced. But if one was too strong, say you had a fever, doctors wouldn't necessarily bleed you. They'd look at the other three and see how they could bring them into balance. Maybe you needed more yellow bile to counter the excess blood, or perhaps some phlegm to cool the heat. So they might feed you something cold and slimy, instead of draining out the hot stuff. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back then, hospitals weren't treating the humors. They were trying to tackle something far worse: spiritual imbalance. Most medieval hospitals weren't medical facilities. They were spiritual retreats. Doctors and clergy believed illnesses were often punishments from God for sinful behavior. Hospitals, therefore, needed to be half church. Most had chapels attached, where patients could hear Mass and confess their sins. Religious art covered the walls. depicting everything from miracles to punishments for the wicked. For the monks running these hospitals, charity was a divine duty. Caring for the sick was a path to enlightenment. But for patients, well, there was little distinction between being cared for and being preached at. They were encouraged to turn their lives over to God, make amends with their neighbors, and prepare for death. And there was plenty to repent for. Back then, poverty and illness were kind of linked. Being sick made people poor, and being poor made people sick. So hospitals ended up treating both problems at once. If you couldn't work because you were ill, you went to a hospital. And if you were in a hospital, you couldn't work, so you stayed poor. Some hospitals did try to help. St. Thomas's Hospital in London, for example, gave patients free food and lodging in exchange for labor. This wasn't exactly an ideal system, but it was a start. Monks and nuns ran most of these hospitals, though some wealthy nobles did open places for profit. Basically, anyone who wanted to get rich off of helping the poor. Those for-profit hospitals often became glorified inns, trapping the sick in rooms with noisy drunks. Of course, not all medieval hospitals were bad. Some became renowned for their treatment, like the Hôtel Dior in Paris. Founded in the 12th century, it became the go-to place for pilgrims with bad cases of the trots, aka diarrhea. But no matter where you went, going to a hospital meant giving up a lot of control. You would surrender yourself to the institution and hope for the best. Often you'd have little say in what happened next. In fact, in some French hospitals, patients weren't even allowed to speak. Silence was seen as a cure for disorders of the mind. Imagine that. So now let's talk about what exactly happened in these hospitals, starting with the most gruesome part, bloodletting. The idea was that illnesses resulted from an imbalance of humors, basically the four elements: fire, water, earth, and air. If your humor was too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry, well, you'd have to balance them. Bloodletting was the most common treatment, because blood was considered the most important humor. By removing some, you could affect the others. There were a few ways to do this. First, you had leeches. Not only were they cheap and plentiful, they also made you look very medieval. Plus, they did have some medicinal uses. Leeches release a chemical that keeps your blood thin, so they can suck up to twice their weight in blood without killing you. But they weren't super precise tools. So, after the leech attack, doctors would have to cauterize the wound with a red-hot musket ball, or sear it shut with a red-hot musket ball, because why not? Then there was the issue of what to do with the leeches after they'd had their fill. The last thing you wanted was a leech escapee crawling around your bed at night looking for a midnight snack. So after the job was done, they'd either have to be killed or carefully removed one by one. Can you imagine? Now, all this blood draining sounds terrible today, but back then it was seen as a cure for everything from headaches to depression. If you were a woman whose husband thought you were too chatty, he could take you to a hospital and get you bled to treat your hysteria. Don't believe me? Ask Sydenham's Hospital in London, who offered this treatment regularly in the 17th century. And it wasn't just women. The famous King George II was bled frequently. His doctors felt that keeping him weak was the best way to keep his power in check. But bloodletting wasn't the only way to treat these humoral imbalances. Some hospitals combine traditional medicine with, well, magic. Doctors would rub parts of the body with relics from saints, hoping to transfer their powers to the sick. Certain herbs were also believed to have special healing properties, so they were often brewed into teas or ointments to ease various ailments. Rosemary for headaches, sage for coughs, lavender for everything. But not all herbal remedies were so innocent. Deadly nightshade, also called devil's snare, was used in some hospitals to treat everything from toothaches to paralysis. Despite its name, this herb was highly prized by medieval doctors because it was so powerful. Just don't touch it, because deadly nightshade has small doses of morphine and atropine. Atropine is the same compound found in modern antidotes for nerve agents like sarin gas. So imagine being high off nightshade tea, then stumbling around the hospital thinking you're flying before collapsing and dying. But despite all these wacky treatments, medieval hospitals weren't completely insane. Sure, they had their share of quacks, but many places also employed real physicians who took their jobs seriously. The big question is, did any of it work? Well, sometimes. Was the prayer and peace of a religious hospital enough to help a sick person recover? Maybe. But even if it didn't, these hospitals served another purpose. They provided care, housing, and sometimes even dignity to some of the most vulnerable people in medieval society. And that's worth something. Thank you for watching. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, right? Well, during the Middle Ages, visiting one might leave you feeling sicker than when you went in. Join us as we unravel the medieval secrets of hospitals, where the line between treatment and torture was frighteningly thin. The smell hit them first, a cloying mix of sweat, urine, and decay. Then the sight rows upon rows of men, women, and children, many too sick or injured to move, packed tightly into dark, damp rooms. There was little privacy. Patients shared beds, and often entire wards overflowed, spilling out into hallways and courtyards. Imagine lying on a straw pallet, inches from an open sewer, flies buzzing round a half-empty flagon of stale water. Welcome to the medieval hospital. Now, before we dive deep into the horrors of medieval healthcare, let's talk about a blessing and a curse of our modern age, the internet. Okay, now back to those medieval medical marvels. But wait, hold on. Let's rewind a bit, because those medieval hospital conditions weren't always so bad. In fact, the early Christian church was a game changer when it came to caring for the sick. See, up until the fall of Rome, healthcare was largely a matter of personal physicians and apothecaries peddling dubious remedies. The poor and destitute had little access to treatment. When plagues struck, they were left to fend for themselves. But then along came Christianity with a radical idea, institutions dedicated to healing. The first of its kind was the Hotel Dieu, established in Paris in the 7th century by the legendary Bishop Saint Landry. This purpose-built hospital, which still stands today, was a revelation. By the 9th century, other religious orders followed suit. setting up hospitals attached to monasteries and churches. Religious vocations ran these hospitals. Monks and nuns provided care as an expression of their faith. They weren't trained doctors, but they were committed Christians. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience weren't just for show. They actually helped create a more sanitary environment. See, unlike secular hospitals run by wealthy landowners, church-run facilities had fewer rats and lice. Religious workers didn't bring their families or pets to work, and since church doctrine discouraged the consumption of alcohol, there was less drunkenness among the staff. Plus, those vows meant that anyone could work in a hospital, regardless of social status. A former king, like St. Louis of France, or a lowly, wholly stable hand, they were all equal in the eyes of God. So these early hospitals weren't just about healing bodies, they were about healing souls. For the wealthy, they offered a chance to atone for sins by helping the sick. For the poor, they provided a way to live out Christian values without renouncing the world. But how did the quality of care compare to today? Well, let's put it this way. You probably wouldn't want to check yourself in anytime soon. Back then, hospitals were reserved for those who were seriously ill or injured. Everyday ailments were best treated at home with a local apothecary. If you did end up in a medieval hospital, your first stop would be the admitting hall. Here, the sick and dying were sorted. Those with contagious diseases like tuberculosis or leprosy were often sent away to special facilities, sometimes never to return. The rest were admitted based on availability, which meant waiting in the courtyard for a bed could take days. Medieval hospitals specialized in caring for the most desperate cases, amputations, gunshot wounds, long-term illnesses. Doctors visited regularly, though not necessarily by choice. You see, back in the day, medical professionals were in short supply. Barbers, blacksmiths, and even shoemakers often doubled as surgeons, treating minor wounds and setting broken bones. For major issues, folks relied on physicians, but they were pricey. Plus, there were some drawbacks. To save money, many patients opted for a free hospital stay instead of paying a doctor. That is, if they could get in. When a patient did get admitted, their treatment depended on their diagnosis. Common ailments, like fevers or infections, were often addressed with baths, emetics, and laxatives. For chronic conditions, physicians might employ leeching, lancing, or cupping to balance the body's humors. Fractures were set and bandaged, but surgery was a last resort. Many patients simply endured their pain, relying on divine intervention and the nursing staff for comfort. Speaking of the nursing staff, they played a crucial role. Lay brothers and sisters, typically men or women who had taken vows of service, provided basic care. They fed patients, changed dressings, and performed the unglamorous tasks necessary for survival. These unsung heroes rarely received formal medical training. Instead, they learned on the job, often through trial and error. Their intimate contact with the sick made them valuable observers of symptoms and potential cures. Over time, this informal apprenticeship system created a wealth of practical knowledge about herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and daily routines that could alleviate suffering and even save lives. One big advantage of the lay nursing staff was that they were generally not afraid to get their hands dirty. Changing dressings, cleaning wounds, and assisting during childbirth were not considered particularly glamorous tasks. But someone had to do them. The nursing staff also had a unique perspective on the hospital. They saw firsthand how overcrowding, lack of ventilation, and unsanitary conditions affected patients. They witnessed the power of fresh air, sunlight, and proper nutrition in aiding recovery. This practical wisdom, born out of necessity and honed through experience, was a vital part of medieval healthcare. But what about those miracle cures? Medieval hospitals kept detailed records of treatments, recording every remedy tried and the results observed. Though not always successful, these efforts led to fascinating insights into the human body. Take, for example, the record-keeping of the Hotel Dieu in Paris. In the 1300s, the hospital began documenting every case admitted, including the symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. While today we might scoff at some of the treatments recorded, things like bloodletting or the use of amulets, we should marvel at the meticulous record-keeping. These records aren't just a historical curiosity. They're a testament to the evolution of medical science. By recording both successes and failures, medieval hospitals contributed to a vast body of knowledge about the human body and its ailments. But why do we remember hospitals for bloodletting and ignoring germ theory? Well, it comes down to one fateful visitor. In the mid-1800s, the English physician Florence Nightingale changed the face of healthcare. Her emphasis on sanitation, statistics, and systematic care transformed hospitals from places of last resort to institutions of healing. Her legacy overshadows the contributions of centuries of medieval healthcare workers. Why? Because progress isn't always linear. We often forget the countless individuals whose work laid the foundation for the advancements we celebrate today. No story of medieval hospitals is complete without mentioning the plague. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, hospitals were overwhelmed. Imagine thousands of coughing, feverish patients crammed into wards with no real understanding of germs. The treatments: burning herbs, rubbing onions on buboes, or, yes, more bloodletting. Spoiler, none of these worked. But what's fascinating is that medieval hospitals did keep records. Monks would note symptoms, outcomes, and even patterns. They didn't understand bacteria, but they saw connections. Overcrowding spread sickness, fresh air helped, certain herbs eased pain. In their own slow medieval way, they were doing data collection. Some hospitals became famous. The Hotel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century, was one of the biggest. It had hundreds of beds, although bed often meant 2 or 3 patients crammed into one. Still, it was revolutionary, a permanent institution dedicated to care. And let's not forget the strange side of hospital medicine: amulets, prayers to saints, relics pressed to wounds. One popular cure involved drinking water that had touched a saint's bone. Another, writing Bible verses on parchment and literally eating them. Nothing says balanced diet like swallowing the Gospel of John with your broth. Yet, despite all this, people came, rich or poor, noble or beggar. If you were sick, the hospital was often your only hope. It wasn't just medicine. It was community. Food for the hungry, a bed for the weary, care for the dying. So, the next time you walk into a bright, clean, modern hospital, with its humming machines and doctors who, thankfully, don't reach for leeches, spare a thought for the medieval version. A place where healing meant prayer, pain relief came with a candlelit chant, and survival often hung by a thread of faith. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet candlelit hall, with its rows of coughing patients and murmuring monks, is the reason we even have hospitals at all. Thank you for watching.